Katie Causey, welcome, and thanks for being here. We're doing this a little bit differently than the other interviews to so our audience understands that you were unable to come into our garage studio for a live taping of this. So we've made other arrangements via Zoom. So thanks for being here. I think the best place to start, given that you're a first-time candidate and have no previous political experience in Palo Alto, is really to ask you to describe your motivations for running. Why are you doing this and why now?
Certainly. So I have wanted to run for this seat since I was 15. It was always something that was in the back of my head. I was a freshman in the district during a really difficult time. Multiple students had taken their own lives. We were in a recession. And I always sort of played with the idea of like, I'll do this one day. I went to college. A lot of my coursework was looking at each week we would get a case from a school or a community, whether that be a Title IX violation or like a community mediation case, and we would be walked through how to come to solutions that benefit everybody. And I was like, oh, like a lot of these are really relevant to the district. And I was like, and I started watching a few board meetings in college, and I was like, oh, I really like this. And then I got back to the area after college. On a whim, did a program that trains women to run for office. And then every person in that program was like, please run for school board. And I started watching board. I've now watched or attended every board meeting for over a year. And I really love them. And it really has drawn me to this position a lot, and it means a lot to me to help give students a voice and to support community members during this time.
So before we move on to some of the issues, I just want to clarify what your current employment situation is, because you're listed as community advocate, nonprofit fundraiser, and I'm wondering, are you employed currently? What is your job?
Right now, I'm not working. I, like a lot of people, I didn't know what was going to happen this year. And I was doing some freelance work at the beginning of the year. I have described my occupation in most professional settings as community advocate for the majority of the last year, just because the feedback I've gotten from other people in the nonprofit industry is that best encompasses what I do. But right now I'm not working just because it's a pandemic, and I'm spending all my time campaigning.
Okay. And when you say you were freelancing, what kind of freelance work did you do? Writing, or what is?
I did. I've done a variety of different things, whether that's like helping with events, one-off, helping with. I was an assistant to a campaign, to Josh Becker's campaign at the end of last year. Most of it has been helping with either nonprofits, campaigns, or kind of community events or community initiatives. The last thing I did was right before the pandemic, I was doing some freelance web design right before the start of the pandemic.
Okay, great. One of the things that you've emphasized in your campaigns so far is the need for a greater student voice in decision making, and just your concerns about student needs. And you're also a supporter of the Vote 16 campaign to allow students to actually vote in local school board elections, among other things. I'm wondering, you've now been out of high school for several years, obviously. I think you're 26?
26, yeah.
26. I'm curious as to whether you recall having views during high school about the way high school should run, that now, with the benefit of some 6 or 7 years out, you think you have second thoughts about?
Ooh, that's a fantastic question. I think, honestly, I think the only thing that has changed, what has changed since high school? I think that the only thing that has changed for me is a broader understanding of how issues work in the district. And I think that part of that, I think when you're a student and you see something when you see something that doesn't work, I think it's easy to feel like maybe it's on that one teacher or like it's on that one administrator. And from my time of like watching board meetings over the years, I think the only thing that's really changed is like a broader understanding of how issues work. You know, if a you know, let's say I was in high school and I wasn't having a positive experience with a teacher. Also understanding, you know, I like to come into situations assuming like hard work and good intention, and understanding that, you know, okay, that teacher might be spread really thin. They might not have had the professional development that they need in this area, or an administrator might be a person who does many, many different roles. And I think that's really the only thing that's changed. And I think, and going back to what you said earlier, so to me, part of in last year I wrote the op-ed supporting Vote 16. There was kind of two angles I was coming at from that, which part of this I touched on in the op-ed, which is like, there's a very abstract way to talk about civic engagement. And then there's also how it directly connects to student mental health, which is something that nonprofits like Project Safety Net have talked about. There's a way, especially right now, especially when like there's a lot of very large, unpredictable issues happening. Civic engagement is a way to help students feel much more in control. And that's been really important to me throughout this. This is a position that is in many ways your only job. It's like students are your primary constituency. And so like it was important to me. My campaign Instagram, we follow over 2,000 students. Every time that the board is coming to a big decision, we put it on the Instagram and we have students give feedback on it and give their thoughts on it. And I think that to me, this position, it was really important to me that this position is one that students feel as connected to as possible. And part of that is also just teaching students like recognize who your local representative is.
Great, Katie. I'm curious now to talk about the reopening plans. Of course, it's much debated, lots of tension in the air right now. Can you just start with telling us what your stance is about the reopening plans and how you got to that standpoint?
I think my stance has always been that we act very cautiously as we approach reopening. I think that we act cautiously and that we're hearing everybody and that it feels like it's a very collaborative process. As we know, so right now it's Monday, September 28th. Tomorrow night is going to be the vote to approve the reopening, the current proposed reopening. What concerns me right now from just like a governance perspective is that from just a very detached governance perspective, how many people feel terrified about the reopening. And it's funny because I was reviewing this last year, the board adopted the Governance Core, which is a book which they adopted for informal onboarding. And I was reviewing that last night, and in it talks about like if a vote feels controversial, that something's gone wrong. Like if something voting doesn't, I believe the exact phrase is voting doesn't solve controversy. And I think right now what my biggest concern is from just this is a position where you're there to give oversight is that I want to understand that we are like that everybody is being heard as we come to solutions that are acting really cautious, where we act very cautiously.
So does cautiously mean that the district, do you think, should delay its decision-making on this reopening because we're looking at October just around the corner at the end of this week? So is this a situation where you think the board should delay the reopenings, or does it just rely on people feeling like they've been heard and then we can proceed, as has been planned so far?
I think I'll just be direct. Like if I was on the board now, from what I've seen so far, and this could change because I am getting, just like everybody, I'm getting a lot of community feedback during this time. And I think that I think if I was on the board now, I would probably vote no for tomorrow, only because from just, again, perspective of, and this is all the information I have, when I talk to students, they feel terrified. When I talk to parents, they feel terrified. When I talk to teachers, they feel terrified. And I think that I have so much respect for everybody who's put work into creating our current plan. I think that a lot of hard work has gone into it being really in depth. I'm really worried, and this was expressed at the last meeting, I'm worried that implementing this right now, I'm worried it's a little bit unrealistic to try and implement the current plan, only because as we've seen, I felt like throughout this process, we needed to be a little bit more focused on immediate goals, and reopening has always felt very unpredictable as sort of an unpredictable goal to move towards. I'm a little bit worried if we reopen and shortly after we reopen, we have a case where we need to close again. How does that impact student mental health in terms of having a sudden change a big change in their day-to-day schedule? I think that it concerns me how many community members and how many teachers feel like they haven't been a part of this process. But that's, again, based on the feedback that I'm seeing and the feedback I'm getting, because I'm not on the board now and I haven't seen, everything that the board sees.
So if you had been on the board these last 6 months, what would you have done differently to try to prevent that sort of disconnect and breakdown in trust?
I think that the focusing on immediate goals, there were some things that we always knew going into this. We always knew Zoom learning is not an option for some students. We always knew that there was things about this virus that we did always know. And I think it's just I'm worried that a lot of our time and energy has been spent towards trying to get us to reopening. And I really would have liked us to see really, I think from a really practical sense, having more town halls with community members, with teachers, because it's that, especially right now, the communication has to be critical because we've had a lot of questions from community members of just, how, and we've had questions ourselves at the district of we've been all adjusting to rapidly changing guidelines, and that's been reflected at times when it's you do one thing one week and then the next week it changes when this is open out in the community but the schools aren't open. I would have really liked to see really innovative approaches of working with community partners to try to find what things we can do. We always knew that student mental health was going to be a really big issue during this time, and I think working with past community partners, there's one program I've talked about before, but Beyond Differences is a free program we used to use in our schools that specifically addresses social isolation. Working with community partners like that, even I kind of imagine what if this time was used to develop the next best practices to support vulnerable students? What if we worked with the Magical Bridge Foundation to create options for our special education students? But I think if I had been on the board, I would recommend for a lot of town halls and a lot of meetings with parents and with community members, parents and teachers. I think I would have, I'm not sure if this happened, but I know it was recommended a few months ago on the board that there be a specific point person for just handling questions about the pandemic. That's something that I think is really important. I think a lot the using this time to kind of be really innovative, just because we are a community that's very good at that. And I think that I use this metaphor a lot, but I kind of think about how during the Great Depression, there was a lot of these small puppet shows that popped up, and they were just designed to bring communities joy. And then those turned into a lot of modern day children's theater programs that are pillars in so many communities. And I think if we tried different stuff now, repurposing classified staff who have strong relationships with students to find ways to support them, and working with community partners, it's giving teachers during this time who have really creative ideas about how project-based learning can be done remotely, trying that, and then trying different things, trying different approaches, unconventional approaches, and see if we can develop something really powerful out of that.
So I want to ask you about the achievement gap, because this is one area in which we have not been terribly innovative or successful. So what's one concrete action that you'd advocate for or that you'd take on as a board member to reduce this achievement gap that's so entrenched?
Certainly. So, and before I dive into this answer, I want to give I want to clarify one thing, because not for anybody here, but I think sometimes community members watching the elections, they hear words like opportunity gap, they hear equity, and they're not really sure what that means at best. And some people at worst will feel like they're losing something. So I kind of just want to define like the opportunity gap and equity. And so just to give an example, when I was 10, my reading level started to slip. I became less engaged in class, and I was put into a free after school reading program. And within like a few months, I was back on track. I was engaged in class again. My reading level was up. So when we're talking about the opportunity gap and we're talking about equity, we're just talking about like making sure the students who need support get support. And now to go to my answer, in terms of a specific concrete action, the board has spent the majority of the last year drafting the PAUSD promise, which is both our mission statement and how we measure success in the district. An area of that has not been drafted yet is the equity scorecard, which is how we're going to be measuring equity in the district. And I would really like that to be, right now, when it was proposed, it was just going to be measuring equity from a student level. But the board's discussions on equity for the last year have revolved around either changes in culture or changes to move us towards a concierge education model, is the term that's used in the board meetings, of as soon as a student is struggling, having somebody help them immediately. And I think what the equity scorecard, the role that could play in that is, instead of just having a measure of equity in terms of how students are doing, having it set with not just how students are measured, but how we are looking at curriculum, how we're looking at staffing, how we're looking at hiring. Because if our curriculum doesn't reflect the students it's serving, if students can't see themselves in our curriculum, if they can't see themselves in our leadership, then that's something that does impact the cultural, on the more like cultural side of how you build student trust and how you address that. I think when I talk with professionals in the community, especially mental health professionals, and I ask them about the opportunity gap, they say, and I've talked with mental health professionals about how this relates to mental health. They were like, you have to make sure that the therapists who are on campus reflect the students they're serving, because there's just some students who are never going to go to therapists unless like they see themselves reflected in those therapists.
So I've noticed that in districts like Ravenswood, nonprofits have become active partners committed to helping students to improve their academic performance. Do you see a role for nonprofits to be working with PAUSD to shrink the achievement gap, or do you think that the district has all it needs in order to make that happen?
I think nonprofits could play a role. I think that especially with, I want to be careful what I say about this, because I know that one of the there's kind of mixed feedback I'm getting about how organizations like Dreamcatchers have played in addressing our opportunity gap, and I think that they could play a role. I also know that like it depends on the nonprofit of because I know there's kind of mixed feedback about in terms of the opportunity gap, and that's just one example of is this something we can tutor our way out of or not? And I think the answer is like this could play a role. I think also like it's not just the hands-on education, it's also like how we do cultural changes as well.
I want to ask you about Title IX. You wrote in your response for another organization's endorsement survey that you were motivated to run in part by your own report in high school of sexual harassment and having your case not handled properly, and also experiencing bullying throughout high school. I think by many accounts, the district has changed and improved a lot of those processes related to Title IX, but I'm curious what your assessment is of the district's handling of Title IX and reporting of campus sexual violence and sexual misconduct?
This is, thank you so much for asking this, because I think this is really important, because the first two board meetings, who's ever elected to this position, the first two board meetings have to do with Title IX. I believe the first one is student presentations on Title IX. And so my coursework, I obviously, when I was a freshman, during the middle of the first cluster, I was also going through the process of reporting harassment. And I didn't know what Title IX was at the time. And then I went off to college, and in my program, the first cases they had us looked at were Title IX cases on campus. And I had the privilege of studying under a leading Title IX expert and an attorney from the American Bar Association Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. And a lot of the coursework I did focused on Title IX. And then also I was at my student paper, and that was doing a lot of Title IX coverage. And I think we've improved. There's a lot of areas that we've improved, but when you're addressing a big cultural issue, whether it's mental health or racism or sexual assault, that's a really big cultural change. And I think while in terms of policy, we've improved a lot with Title IX, I think it's also, I'm not sure if you're aware, there's 2 student Instagram accounts that just post stories of students experiencing harassment on campus. And I think I was really proud of the fact a few months ago, there was a student who during the BPRC gave a presentation, which she sought my advising on, about improvements that they wanted to see. And the feedback I get from students is that they want to have mainly a really clear understanding of what the reporting process is and how behavior is addressed. And we saw this reflected, I think it was in August or July, students spoke at the board meetings about this, of not understanding. They wanted to understand like what the reporting process was and then how behavior is addressed. And I think that's kind of the cultural side of what we're talking about when we talk about Title IX issues, because it takes everybody to address harassment and assault. And I think in terms of what I want to see improved, I do want to make sure that students, and what students have asked is that there is a clearly marked button on the board site of the information about reporting, like what it involves and how behavior will be addressed. I want that process to be really clear. I also want to make sure that, and there's an update at this at one of our last board meetings, that the education we're doing on consent right now, it's often like one-off lectures. And this is also something I have a lot of parallels with a lot of the other cultural issues in our district, but I think with making sure our education on consent isn't just one-off lectures, that it's that it is integrated, and that's going to take ongoing work for us to do. Also, and I've supported students on different efforts. Like I know students are working to try to get Title IX information on the back of student IDs, things like that. I also, anytime we're addressing a really big cultural issue like this, I want us to also be working with City Council and other partners in the community, because if we work on something a lot in the schools, but it isn't matched in our neighborhoods, then there's only so far we can go. And I think I wrote about this in one of my questionnaires, but when I was in college in Washington, D.C., there's programs that train like bars and restaurants and hotels too, if you see assault or if you see harassment, how to de-escalate it, how to identify it. And I think we need to, if we do a lot of work on an issue in the schools, we need to make sure that we're collaborating with City Council to make sure it's matched in the community. And I've told students this, I was like, don't be afraid to have community education events on educating on consent, on educating on healthy relationships.
So at the last board meeting, during the talk about the reopening, the board considered suspending the 2-meeting rule. And so I wanted to ask you about the 2-meeting rule and whether you support it or oppose it. And do you think it provides necessary transparency, or do you think it just delays board action?
I support it. I think I'm going to have a rare short answer from me, but I think I think I'm going to, I support it. I think the majority of community feedback is it helps with transparency. I know some people see it as a do it twice rule, but the reality is it's like most people don't have time to follow school board meetings really, really closely. And so I think it does help make sure that we get that necessary community feedback.
Okay, well, I appreciate your clarity on that. I know that you've watched the board meetings of the past couple of years. Is there a decision that you just really strongly disagreed with? And what would you have done in that case for that issue?
It wasn't a specific decision, but I think there was a huge oversight this summer. So during the summer, we do not have student board representatives present because we don't meet that often in the summer. And that makes sense. This summer wasn't like that. Everybody was here this summer, and because of the pandemic, we were having way more school board meetings, and they were, and a lot of them were focused on mental health decisions that directly impact students. And I think it was a really missed opportunity to not find a way to have student board members present at those meetings.
I thought they were present at most of those meetings.
Not the ones that happened during the summer when student board members aren't, the ones that happen during months where student board members aren't normally present. We did not have student board members present.
On the issue of student involvement on policy matters, are there methods that you would promote to increase the weight given to student voice on policy matters by school board members? When students come to testify or to speak before the school board, it often results in frustration because they feel like they were heard, but then not really listened to in terms of the policy outcomes. Do you have any ideas as to how to make students feel more connected to those policy discussions?
Two ideas. One that I've written to the board before, but having having student advisory groups on specific issues. But I would also consider, in 2017, there was a proposal brought to the board by students that would require student input before major decisions, because the majority of feedback is student input. It's often too little, too late. It comes like at the last minute. And I would consider, if something like that was brought back to the board, I would consider moving forward with that, because I think when we hear student voices, it helps us proactively respond to issues before they arise. And this job is one where your primary constituency is student voices, and so I would support that. I'm just playing in my head if there's anything else, any other ideas that I would think of. But I think if a resolution like that was brought to the board, a proposal like that was brought to the board, if it was incorporating it into the PAUSD promise, maybe, I think that's something I would really support.
We're running out of time here. I do want to ask you one question about union negotiations for the teacher contract. As you may know, labor negotiations such as the teacher's contract occur behind closed doors, and a limited view to the public is given usually at the very end when a contract has already been agreed to in closed session by the board, leaving the public with really no opportunity to understand or engage in that negotiating process. Would you, and in some areas, jurisdictions have addressed this by opening up those contract negotiations so that they're all in public. Everybody knows what everybody is saying and proposing, and they can actually see the negotiation unfold. Would you support something like that?
I think that the negotiations should be as transparent as they can be. I want to be careful about how I answer this because, I'm not familiarized with all of the negotiating laws in California. But I think that when they're as transparent as possible, it does really help the public relationship with teachers. I think that I believe in the last year, what we've moved towards is having I think the steps we have made with those negotiations in terms of transparency that I think has helped is talking with making clear to the public the goals that we're moving towards. So are we moving towards is like when we're negotiating, what are we trying to accomplish? Is it retention? Is it related to small class size? I think that has helped, but I would support anything that would make those processes more transparent.
You, interestingly, are the one candidate that's been endorsed by the PAEA, the teachers union, in this campaign. I'm wondering how you would assess the current relationship between school administration and the teachers in the district.
Well, first, thank you for telling me that. I didn't know I was the only one they endorsed. I think right now, whoever is elected to this position, right now, again, we're doing this. It's Monday, September 28th. Tomorrow night is going to be the vote for the approval. I think whoever comes into this position, I think is going to have to rebuild a lot of trust with teachers and community members. And because right now things are very heightened. And again, we have whoever is elected comes into this office in December. We have no idea the decisions we'll be making then because everything has been changing so rapidly. But when I was preparing to run for this position, why I watched all those board meetings and spent a lot of time preparing is like this is a position that right now I believe only has informal onboarding. And there's been people who have been elected to this position before that realize, down the line, they didn't have time to do this position, or it takes them 6 months to get up to speed. I wanted to make sure, and our outgoing board member is one who spent, 40 hours a week doing this position, spent it with a lot of time in the community. I wanted to make sure that was something that I could really do and I could really step into this position. I think right now that's going to be more important than ever. And I know that's something that a lot of community members really trust me to do.
My question, though, was about your assessment of how good the relationship is between the administration and the teachers and the teachers union. Is it good, bad, needs improvement? How would you characterize it?
I think it needs improvement right now. I think there's going to, like I said, I think there's going to have to be a lot of trust rebuilt.
As a result of the COVID handling or deeper issues than that?
Yeah, I think as the result of the pandemic. And again, I'm just going off of the feedback that I've been given from community members and teachers. And I think that communication during this time hasn't been strong enough. And, really listening to each other hasn't been strong enough.
Okay, Katie Causey, thank you very much for joining us today. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.